People think saving a life is a beautiful cinematic moment. It isn't. It's cracked ribs, the smell of stale coffee, and the terrifying realization that someone's existence depends entirely on your own panicked breath. Ethan was just the guy who emptied the trash. Vivian was the billionaire who owned the building. When he pressed his lips to hers on the cold marble floor, it wasn't romance. It was survival, and it ruined both their lives in the best way possible. The city of Chicago did not care that Ethan Hayes was tired. It didn't care that the cartilage in his left knee was ground down to a dull, constant ache, or that the soles of his work boots were worn smooth on the right side. The city only cared that the floors of the 60-story Croft Enterprises building shined by 6 a.m. Ethan pushed his yellow plastic cart out of the service elevator on the 42nd floor. The wheels squeaked, a sharp rhythmic chirp that echoed down the cavernous, glass-walled hallway. It was 10:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. The suits were gone. The building belonged to him now. He parked the cart outside the boardroom, methodically pulling on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. The snap of the rubber against his wrist was a familiar punctuation mark to the start of his shift. Ethan was 34, but the deep lines bracketing his mouth and the permanent dark smudges under his eyes made him look 50. 5 years of watching his wife slowly die of a neurological disease had aged him. The resulting $500,000 in medical debt had buried him. Now, he was just a ghost, haunting the corridors of a corporate empire he couldn't begin to comprehend. He sprayed industrial glass cleaner onto the heavy mahogany boardroom table, wiping it down in tight, overlapping circles. He erased the rings left by sweating water glasses. He erased the smudges of fingerprints. He erased the evidence that powerful people had sat here just hours ago, arguing over millions of dollars while Ethan was at a corner bodega, counting nickels to see if he could buy his 7-year-old daughter, Lucy, a box of off-brand fruit snacks. Lucy! The thought of her sleeping in Mrs. Gable's apartment 2 miles away brought a sharp pang to his chest. Mrs. Gable charged $50 a night to watch her. Ethan made $15 an hour. The math was a slow-motion execution. He tossed the damp rag into the cart's laundry bag and pulled out the vacuum. Ethan understood his place in the world. He was the invisible man. He was the background noise. If a venture capitalist happened to work late and passed him in the hall, their eyes would slide right over his faded blue uniform. They didn't see Ethan. They saw a mop. They saw a function, not a father. And that was fine with him. Visibility meant scrutiny. And scrutiny meant someone might realize he occasionally took half-empty boxes of high-end catered pastries from the break room trash to feed his kid. He moved down the hall to the executive suites. The carpet here was thicker, swallowing the sound of his footsteps. The air smelled different, not just filtered, but expensive. Notes of sandalwood and cold cash. He stopped at the double doors at the end of the hall. The frosted glass read, Vivian Croft, Chief Executive Officer. Ethan rarely saw her. She was a phantom in her own right, a name on the building and a face on the cover of Forbes magazines that he occasionally tossed into the recycling bin. When he did see her, she was usually flanked by severe-looking men in suits, moving with a terrifying kinetic energy. She was sharp edges and tailored wool, operating on a frequency that Ethan couldn't tune into. Tonight, the sliver of light beneath her door was still on. Ethan sighed, leaning on the handle of his cart. If she was in there, he couldn't vacuum the outer office. He'd have to skip it and come back later, throwing off his entire routine. He checked his cheap digital watch. 10:45 p.m. He decided to empty the trash in the adjacent accounting bullpen first. As he dragged the heavy plastic bag out of the first bin, his mind drifted back to the eviction warning folded in his back pocket. 30 days. He had 30 days to come up with $2,000, or he and Lucy were out on the street. He tied a knot in the top of the garbage bag, pulling it tight enough to strain his fingers. The plastic stretched, turning white under the pressure. I just need a break, he thought, the internal monologue a broken record of exhaustion. Just one break. The silence of the 42nd floor was suddenly broken by a dull, heavy thud. It came from the CEO's office. Ethan froze, the garbage bag suspended in his hand. He listened. The HVAC system hummed its low, steady drone. The city traffic outside was a distant, muted ocean. For 10 seconds, there was nothing else. He told himself it was a dropped book, a briefcase falling off a chair. Then he heard the sound of glass shattering, followed by a wet, desperate gasp. Vivian Croft was suffocating under the weight of her own empire. At 31, she had inherited a sprawling logistics and tech conglomerate from a father who treated affection like a finite resource and business like a blood sport. She had spent the last 3 years fighting off a hostile takeover from her own board of directors, a group of aging men who looked at her and saw a little girl playing dress-up in her father's boardroom. She sat behind her custom marble desk, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The glow of 3 computer monitors illuminated her face in harsh blue light. Her eyes were bloodshot. She hadn't slept a full night in 6 months. "They're going to vote no on the merger," she muttered to the empty room, tossing a Mont Blanc pen onto the desk. It clattered against a stack of unread legal briefs. She was completely alone. That was the reality of the view from the top. Everyone wanted her money, her influence, or her job. Nobody just wanted Vivian. Her phone buzzed, a text from her ex-fiancé, a hedge fund manager who had left her when he realized he would never be the most important thing in her life. She didn't read it. She swiped it away. Her stomach gave a hollow growl. She looked at the silver catering tray sitting on the glass coffee table across the room. Her assistant had ordered it for her hours ago from some new fusion restaurant downtown. Vivian stood, her heels sinking into the plush rug. She was exhausted to her bones, the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. She walked over to the tray and pulled off the silver dome, a complex-looking salad with seared tuna, and an assortment of garnishes she didn't recognize. She didn't care. It was calories. She picked up a fork and took a large bite, chewing absent-mindedly as she walked back to her desk, her eyes already drawn back to the spreadsheets. It started as a tickle in the back of her throat. Vivian swallowed hard, reaching for her water glass. She took a sip. The water didn't clear the tickle. Instead, the sensation morphed into a hot, swelling itch. She coughed. Once. Twice. Her hand went to her neck. The skin felt flushed, hot to the touch. A sudden terrifying realization hit her. The caterer. The new restaurant. Walnut oil. She had told her assistant 100 times she was violently allergic to tree nuts. It was in her file. It was on every memo. But her assistant was new. The old one had quit last week. Vivian tried to draw a breath, but the air hitched. Her airway was closing. The swelling was aggressive, rapid, and entirely unforgiving. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. No, not now. Not like this. She lunged for her purse on the floor next to her desk, tearing it open. Her hands were shaking violently. Lipsticks, a wallet, keys spilled onto the carpet. Where was her EpiPen? She always carried 2. She couldn't find them. She had switched bags that morning. The black Birkin, not the navy one. The pens were in the navy one. Her lungs screamed. She tried to inhale, but only a thin, reedy squeak escaped her lips. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges darkening with black static. She slammed her hands onto the desk, knocking over the water glass. It shattered against the marble floor. She needed her phone. She needed to dial 911. Vivian staggered backward, clutching her throat. Her legs gave out. She hit the floor hard, the impact knocking the remaining air from her chest. Money buys a lot of things. It buys penthouses, politicians, and private jets. But as Vivian lay on the floor of her multi-million-dollar office, staring up at the acoustic ceiling tiles, she realized the ultimate cynical truth. $1 billion in liquid assets couldn't buy her a single cubic inch of oxygen. She was going to die here, alone. The board would get their way. Her father's legacy would be chopped up and sold for parts. Her vision darkened further. The edges of the room dissolved. She clawed frantically at the collar of her silk blouse, tearing a button off. It plinked against the shattered glass. Her chest heaved in violent, useless spasms. The darkness was creeping in, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Then, the frosted glass door of her office burst open. Through the fading light of her vision, she saw a silhouette framed in the doorway. It wasn't security. It wasn't a doctor. It was a man in a faded blue uniform holding a garbage bag. Ethan dropped the trash bag. For a fraction of a second, his brain couldn't process the scene. The immaculate office was a wreck. Water pooled on the hardwood. Shards of glass caught the light. And on the floor, thrashing in a tangle of expensive silk and limbs, was Vivian Croft. Her face was swollen, her lips tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. Her eyes were wide, bulging with blind animal panic. Ethan didn't think. The time for thinking was gone. He sprinted across the room, sliding the last 2 feet on his knees, not caring about the broken glass that bit through the fabric of his trousers. "Ms. Croft! Hey, look at me!" he yelled, his voice cracking the sterile silence of the room. She didn't look at him. She was clawing at her neck, her fingernails leaving angry red streaks in her pale skin. Ethan grabbed her wrists, pinning them down. "Stop! You're hurting yourself. What is it? Choking." She shook her head wildly, a horrible, high-pitched wheeze squeaking past her lips. Ethan's eyes darted around. The spilled salad. The panicked search in the purse. He wasn't a doctor, but his wife had suffered from severe medication reactions during her treatment. He knew anaphylaxis when he saw it. "Allergic reaction. Where's your pen? Where's the EpiPen?" he demanded. Vivian managed one frantic shake of her head. "Don't have it." Her eyes rolled back. Her body went horrifyingly limp. The thrashing stopped. "No, no, no, no," Ethan muttered. He pressed 2 fingers to her carotid artery. The pulse was there, but it was racing, erratic, like a bird trapped in a snare. And she wasn't breathing. Her airway was completely shut. Ethan pulled his radio from his belt, his thumb jamming the emergency button. Frank, are you there? Code red in the CEO's office. Call 911 right now. She's not breathing. Anaphylaxis. Hurry!" He tossed the radio aside. He didn't wait for a response. 9 minutes. That's the average response time for an ambulance in downtown Chicago. If her brain went without oxygen for more than 4, she was a vegetable. If she went past 6, she was a corpse. Ethan leaned over her. This wasn't a movie. There was no sweeping soundtrack. There was only the smell of his own sweat, the sharp tang of the floor wax, and the agonizing realization that he was the only thing standing between this woman and the void. He tilted her head back, lifting her chin to open the airway as much as structurally possible. He pinched her nose shut. He took a deep breath, filling his own lungs until they ached, and sealed his mouth over hers. He blew hard. It wasn't gentle. It was a forceful, desperate attempt to force air past the swollen tissues of her throat. He met massive resistance. It felt like trying to blow up a brick wall. He pulled back, gasped for air, and tried again. Harder. He pushed with everything he had in his diaphragm. He felt a tiny sliver of air slip past the obstruction. Her chest rose, just a fraction of an inch. Come on, he chanted, pulling away to let the air escape. He pressed his fingers to her neck again. The pulse was fading now, slowing down. Her heart was giving up. He shifted his weight, placing the heel of his hand squarely in the center of her chest, right on the sternum. He laced his other hand on top, locking his elbows. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. The CPR class he had taken at the community center when Lucy was born flashed through his mind. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted out loud, throwing the weight of his upper body into her chest. Crack. Ethan felt the sickening pop of cartilage and bone giving way under his hands. He flinched, but he didn't stop. You break ribs to save a life. That was the rule. 8, 9, 10. Sweat poured down his face, dripping off his chin onto her silk blouse. His knee throbbed where a piece of broken glass had embedded itself, but the pain was distant, irrelevant. In 28, 29, 30. He dropped back down, pinched her nose, and forced his breath into her lungs again. Push, push, Push. He imagined the air as a physical wedge, driving apart the swollen walls of her throat. He moved back to her chest. Compressions, violent rhythmic thrusts. "Don't die on my shift," he gritted out through his teeth. "You don't get to die on my shift. Come on!" Time distorted. It could have been 2 minutes. It could have been 20. Ethan was a machine made of adrenaline and desperation. His arms felt like lead. His lungs burned. On the 4th cycle of compressions, a terrible wet sound erupted from Vivian's chest. Her body convulsed. She arched off the floor, her eyes flying open. She sucked in a massive, ragged breath that sounded like tearing canvas. Ethan fell back onto his haunches, gasping, his hands hovering in the air. Vivian rolled onto her side, coughing violently, dragging air into her starved lungs. It was ugly. There was drool and tears. The makeup she had meticulously applied that morning was smeared across her face, but she was breathing. The harsh blue tint was slowly draining from her lips. The heavy double doors of the office banged open. 3 paramedics rushed in, flanked by Frank, the night security guard, who looked pale and terrified. "Over here," Frank yelled. The paramedics swarmed her. They moved with clinical efficiency. A needle plunged into her thigh. Epinephrine. An oxygen mask was clamped over her face. The air in the room was suddenly filled with medical jargon and the crackle of 2-way radios. Ethan was pushed backward. A paramedic's heavy boot stepped on his hand, not intentionally, just caught in the rush. Ethan scrambled backward on the slick marble floor, pulling his hand to his chest. He watched from the periphery as they stabilized her. They strapped her to a collapsible gurney. Through the clear plastic of the oxygen mask, Vivian's eyes were open, glassy and unfocused, but alive. As they rolled her out, the wheels of the gurney catching on the thick carpet, her head lolled to the side. For a split second, her eyes met Ethan's. He was kneeling by his yellow plastic cart, his uniform covered in her sweat, his knee bleeding onto the floor. He didn't know if she actually saw him or if he was just a blur in her shock-addled brain. Then they were gone. The office was dead quiet again. Ethan sat on the floor for a long time, listening to his own heart hammer against his ribs. He looked at his hands. They were trembling violently. He slowly pushed himself up. His knee screamed in protest. He looked at the mess, the shattered glass, the blood, the ruined silk button on the floor. Ethan limped over to his cart. He pulled out the dustpan and a broom. He swept up the glass. He used the heavy-duty cleaner to scrub the small spot of blood from his own knee off the hardwood. He was the janitor. There was a mess. It was his job to clean it up. He finished the shift, emptied the remaining trash, and clocked out at 6 a.m. He walked out into the freezing Chicago dawn, completely unaware that his invisible life had just collided with the top of the world, and nothing would ever be the same again. The VIP suite at Chicago General Hospital did not smell like sickness. It smelled like heavily bleached linens and the expensive generic floral arrangements that arrived by the dozen every hour. Vivian opened her eyes to a white, acoustic-tiled ceiling. It was the second time in 24 hours she had woken up staring at tiles, but these were clean. She tried to take a deep breath. A sharp, blinding pain immediately spiked through her left side, stealing the air right back. She gasped, her hand instinctively flying to her ribcage. Under the thin hospital gown, her torso was wrapped tightly in thick bandages. "Don't do that." The voice came from the corner of the room. David, her chief operating officer, was sitting in a vinyl visitor's chair. His suit was immaculate, completely free of wrinkles, which meant he had gone home, slept, showered, and changed while she was unconscious. He was tapping away on his iPad, barely looking up. "You have 3 fractured ribs," David said, his tone flat. "Doctor said someone went at your chest like they were trying to tenderize a flank steak, but you're breathing, which is good because the board was already drafting a statement of succession." Vivian swallowed. Her throat felt like it was lined with crushed glass. The merger vote? Postponed," David replied, finally looking up. He didn't look relieved that she was alive. He looked annoyed by the delay. We bought 72 hours. PR is spinning this as a minor reaction to a new medication. The stock dipped 2 points at the opening bell, but it's stabilizing. You need to be seen walking out of here tomorrow, Viv. Smiling, Vivian turned her head toward the window. The city skyline was a jagged gray graph against a pale morning sky. She ignored David's corporate triage. Her mind was clawing backward, piecing together the fragmented shards of the previous night, the suffocating panic, the darkness, and then the heavy crushing weight on her chest, the violent forcing of air into her lungs. She remembered the smell of industrial floor wax and cheap laundry detergent. She remembered a face hovering over hers, lined, exhausted, eyes wide with a frantic, aggressive determination. "Who called 911?" she rasped. David frowned, checking an email on his phone. "Building security. Frank, I think his name is. We're sending him a gift basket. Charcuterie or something." "It wasn't Frank," Vivian said. Her voice was weak, but the iron edge of authority was creeping back in. "Frank didn't do CPR. Frank didn't break my ribs. Someone else was in the room." "Does it matter?" David sighed, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "You're alive. The EMTs said whoever did the compression saved your brain function, even if they lacked finesse. I'll have HR look into who was on the floor. Right now, we have to draft your statement for the press." Vivian closed her eyes. Finesse. She had been dead on her office floor. Finesse didn't bring people back from the dead. Brutality did. The brutal, unforgiving refusal to let her stop breathing. 2 miles away, in a cramped 2-room apartment in a neighborhood the city had long forgotten, Ethan was dealing with his own brutal realities. He stood in a tiny kitchenette, wrapping a line of silver duct tape around the cracked handle of a frying pan. Sizzling margarine popped, spitting hot grease onto the Formica counter. He tossed in 2 cracked eggs, watching the whites bubble and crisp at the edges. "Dad, I can't find my spelling book. My spelling." Lucy padded into the kitchen. She was 7, with a mop of unruly brown curls and eyes that were entirely too observant for a child her age. She was wearing a faded pink t-shirt that had belonged to her cousin 3 years ago. "Check under the couch cushion," Ethan said, his voice a low rumble. He kept his weight shifted entirely to his right leg. His left knee, the one he had slid on through the shattered glass, was a swollen, throbbing mess. He had cleaned the cut with rubbing alcohol and taped a paper towel over it. He couldn't afford a trip to the clinic. Lucy dropped to her knees in the living room, digging under the sagging floral sofa. "Found it!" "Good. Eat." Ethan slid the eggs onto a chipped ceramic plate and set it on the small card table that served as their dining room. He didn't eat. He poured himself a mug of black, bitter coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the warmer since yesterday afternoon. He took a sip and let his eyes drift to the refrigerator. Pinned under a magnet shaped like a smiling tooth was a bright yellow envelope. The eviction notice. 30 days. Well, 28 now. He needed $2,000. He had $84 in his checking account. The math was a physical weight on his chest, heavier than the exhaustion in his bones. He had picked up a weekend shift at a warehouse, but it wouldn't be enough. He needed a miracle, and Ethan didn't believe in miracles. He believed in compound interest, late fees, and the inescapable gravity of poverty. "Are you okay, Dad?" Lucy asked, her fork hovering over her eggs. She was watching him, her small brow furrowed. "You walk funny today." "I'm fine, Bug," Ethan lied, forcing a tight smile. He limped over and ruffled her hair. "Just tweaked my knee at work. Nothing a little coffee can't fix." He grabbed her backpack, stuffing the spelling book inside. His hands were still slightly raw from the frantic compressions he had performed hours ago. He pushed the memory away. The woman lived. The ambulance took her. His shift ended. That was the extent of his involvement. He was a janitor. He cleaned up messes and moved on. "Come on," Ethan said, grabbing his coat. "Mrs. Gable is waiting to walk you to school. and I need to sleep before my next shift. He walked her down the peeling, paint-chipped hallway to the neighbor's door, handed over 5 crumpled $10 bills for the week's childcare, and went back to his apartment. Ethan sat on the edge of his unmade bed, staring at the wall. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, round object. He had found it when he was sweeping up the glass in the CEO's office. It was a small, heavy button, solid gold, torn from a silk blouse. He turned it over in his calloused fingers. To the woman on the floor, it was garbage, a ruined piece of clothing. To Ethan, it looked like a pawn shop exchange, maybe $30, enough for groceries for the week. He set the button on the nightstand, lay back, and closed his eyes. The yellow envelope on the fridge seemed to glow through the walls. 3 days later, the Croft Enterprises building was humming with its usual ruthless efficiency. Ethan pushed his yellow cart out of the service elevator on the 30th floor. It was 8 p.m. He was moving slower tonight. His knee had stiffened into a permanent grinding ache, and the lack of sleep was making his vision swim at the edges. He was halfway through emptying the recycling bins in the marketing department when his heavy black walkie-talkie hissed with static. "Ethan, come in. Over." It was Stan, the night shift supervisor. Stan only used the radio when someone had thrown up in an elevator or pipe had burst. Ethan unclipped the radio. "Yeah, Stan, I'm here." "Leave the cart. Get up to 42, immediately." Ethan's stomach dropped. 42, the executive floor, the CEO's office. "What's the issue?" Ethan asked, pressing the talk button. "I didn't schedule 42 until 11. "Not to clean, Ethan. Security came down here. They want you up there. Just go." The radio clicked off. Ethan stood frozen in the fluorescent light of the bullpen. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. They figured it out. They reviewed the security footage. They saw him break her ribs. Or maybe he missed some of the blood on the floor. Corporate didn't thank janitors. They fired them for liability reasons. A broken rib could be a lawsuit. Unsanitary conditions could be a firing offense. If he lost this job, the 28 days to eviction would turn into 0. He wiped his sweating palms on his uniform trousers, abandoned the cart, and walked to the main elevators. He pressed the button for 42. The ride up was agonizingly smooth, a silent ascent to the executioner's block. The doors slid open. The 42nd floor was deathly quiet, the thick carpets absorbing all sound. Ethan walked slowly down the hallway, past the boardroom he scrubbed every night, toward the double-frosted doors. They were open. Standing outside the office was a man in a sharp suit. David, though Ethan didn't know his name. The man looked Ethan up and down, his eyes lingering with obvious distaste on the faded blue uniform and scuffed work boots. "You're the maintenance worker," David said. It wasn't a question. "Janitor," Ethan corrected, his voice flat. "I'm the janitor." David checked his watch. "She's waiting. Don't take up too much of her time." Ethan stepped past him and walked into the office. It was pristine. The shattered glass was gone. The water was dried. The desk was immaculate. Sitting behind it, illuminated by the glow of her monitors, was Vivian Croft. She looked different. 3 days ago, she was a terrifying shade of blue, a chaotic mess of sprawling limbs and panic. Tonight, she was perfectly composed. She wore a tailored black blazer, though Ethan noticed she sat rigidly straight, clearly favoring her left side. Her face was pale, the dark circles under her eyes rivaling his own. Vivian looked up as he entered. She didn't speak immediately. She just looked at him, her sharp, calculating eyes mapping every inch of his exhausted face, the permanent crease in his brow, the dirt under his fingernails. "You," she finally said. Her voice was slightly raspy, a lingering side effect of the swelling. "Me," Ethan replied, standing awkwardly in the center of the room. He didn't know what to do with his hands, so he crossed his arms over his chest. "Security pulled the hallway logs," Vivian said, leaning back slightly, then wincing as the movement pulled at her taped ribs. You badged onto this floor at 10:15 p.m. You radioed Frank at 10:52 p.m. By the time the EMTs arrived, I was stabilized. You saved my life." Ethan shifted his weight off his bad knee. "I did compressions. The EMTs saved your life." "You broke 3 of my ribs," she stated. Ethan felt the panic spike, but he clamped down on it. He met her gaze dead on. He couldn't afford to look weak. "You were dead on the floor. You had no pulse and your airway was shut tight. You break ribs to pump a heart. If you want to fire me for destroying company property, go ahead, but I'd do it again." Vivian stared at him. For a long, uncomfortable moment, the silence stretched between them. The billionaire and the janitor, separated by 20 feet of imported rug and a chasm of social class. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of Vivian's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not exactly, but the coldness in her eyes fractured. "I'm not going to fire you, mister." She glanced at a piece of paper on her desk. "Mr. Hayes." Ethan exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Okay, then why am I here?" Vivian carefully opened a desk drawer and pulled out a slim, cream-colored envelope. She placed it in the center of the marble desk. "When people in my world do something for me," Vivian said slowly, her tone clinical, "they leverage it. They want a promotion. They want insider information. They want a piece of the pie. You cracked my chest open, blew air into my lungs, handed me off to the paramedics. And then what? Frank said you finished your shift and went home." "I get paid by the hour," Ethan said simply. "My shift wasn't over. You didn't leave a note. You didn't ask for a reward." Vivian tapped her perfectly manicured finger against the envelope. "Why?" Ethan looked at the envelope. He knew exactly what was inside. Money. Hush money. Reward money. Guilt money. It didn't matter what she called it. "Because saving someone isn't a transaction," Ethan said, the cynicism bleeding into his voice. "It was Tuesday. You were dying. I was there. That's the whole story, Ms. Croft." "I don't like debts," Vivian said. She slid the envelope across the smooth marble. "There is $50,000 in a cashier's check in there. It's yours. For services rendered. Take it, and we are square." Ethan stared at the envelope. $50,000. His brain short-circuited. 50,000. That was the eviction notice, torn up and burned. That was Lucy's new shoes. That was groceries for a year. That was breathing room. He walked slowly toward the desk. The sheer magnitude of the money sitting in that little paper rectangle made his hands tremble slightly. He reached out and let his fingertips brush the thick paper. He looked up at Vivian. She was watching him, a look of bored expectation on her face. She expected him to take it. She expected him to fawn over it, to thank her profusely, to disappear back into the shadows of her building, bought and paid for. Ethan's jaw tightened. He was drowning, yes. But looking at the cold, transactional look in her eyes, the way she dismissed the violent, intimate terror they had shared on this very floor as a mere invoice to be paid, ignited a spark of deep, stubborn pride in his chest. He pulled his hand back. "Keep it," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. Vivian frowned, her mask of composure slipping for a second. "Excuse me?" "Keep the money," Ethan repeated, stepping away from the desk. "I didn't kiss a billionaire on the floor of her office to get a paycheck. I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of someone dying alone in the dark." He turned on his heel, his bad knee screaming as he pivoted. "I have trash to empty on 30, he threw over his shoulder as he walked toward the door. "Glad you're feeling better, Ms. Croft." He walked out, leaving the check on the desk, and leaving Vivian Croft staring after him, completely and utterly speechless for the first time in her life. Ethan made it exactly 3 floors down before the adrenaline burned off and the sheer, staggering reality of what he had just done hit him. He was standing in the men's restroom on the 39th floor, staring at his reflection in the mirror over a row of porcelain sinks. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash. His skin was gray, his eyes were wide and hollow. $50,000. He gripped the edges of the sink until his knuckles turned white. He squeezed his eyes shut, but all he could see was the yellow eviction notice magnetized to his refrigerator. All he could hear was Lucy asking why he was walking funny. "I didn't kiss a billionaire to get a paycheck." The words echoed in his head, entirely stripped of the righteous indignation they had carried in Vivian Croft's office. Now, they just sounded arrogant. They sounded stupid. He had chosen his own bruised ego over his daughter's security. He had traded $50,000 for a fleeting moment of moral superiority. Ethan turned on the cold water and splashed it over his face, gasping at the shock of the temperature. He wasn't a hero. He was a cornered animal who had just bitten the only hand offering a way out of the trap. But the way she had looked at him, like he was a vendor submitting an invoice for a clogged toilet. Services rendered. It had triggered a deep, ugly resentment he had been burying since the hospital bills first started piling up during his wife's illness. The wealthy believed everything had a price tag. They believed every human interaction could be neatly resolved with a ledger entry. He dried his face with a rough brown paper towel. The choice was made. The bridge was burned. He had to figure out how to make $2,000 in 28 days, or they were sleeping in his rusted 12-year-old sedan. He grabbed his mop and went back to work. Up on the 42nd floor, the check remained exactly where Ethan had left it, sitting squarely on the center of the marble desk. Vivian stared at it. The silence in the office was deafening. She was entirely unaccustomed to the word no. She lived in an ecosystem built on transactional compliance. People did what she wanted because she paid them to, or because they feared she would stop paying them. That was the physics of her universe. Ethan Hayes had just broken the laws of physics. David walked back into the office, his tablet tucked under his arm. He glanced at the check, then at Vivian. "Did the janitor want more? I told you we should have had legal draft a non-disclosure agreement first. If he's holding out for a settlement..." "He didn't want more, David," Vivian interrupted. Her voice was quiet. She picked up the cream-colored envelope and slid it back into her desk drawer. "He didn't want any of it." David frowned, genuinely confused. "I don't understand." "Neither do I." Vivian leaned forward, wincing as her ribs protested the movement. The dull, constant ache in her chest was a physical tether to the man who had just walked out on her. "I want to know who he is." "He's a maintenance worker. Outsourced through Zenith Facilities Management. Started here 3 years ago." "I don't want his resume," Vivian said, her eyes narrowing. "I want to know him. Find out where he lives. Find out what he owes. Find out why a man who cleans up garbage at midnight walks away from 50 grand. Get an investigator on it, discreetly." David sighed, clearly finding the request a waste of resources. "Vivian, the board meeting is in 2 days. We have a hostile takeover to fend off. You don't have time to play philanthropist with the night staff. Do it, David." The steel was back in her voice, the cold, unyielding edge that had made her father choose her over her older brothers. David nodded tightly. "First thing tomorrow." He left her alone. Vivian turned her chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city was a glittering grid of lights, a sprawling machine of commerce and struggle. She touched her collarbone, tracing the line down to where her ribs were taped. "I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of someone dying alone in the dark." She swallowed hard. The memory of the suffocating terror flared up, burning the back of her throat. She had been completely, utterly alone. All her money, all her leverage, all her degrees, and she had been reduced to a dying animal on the floor. He had waded into that terror. He had broken her bones to keep her here, and she had offered him a tip. A sharp, unfamiliar pang of shame twisted in her stomach. It felt worse than the broken ribs. The report arrived on her desk 24 hours later in a manila folder. Vivian closed her office door and opened the file. It wasn't thick. Ethan Hayes didn't have a complicated life. He had a ruined one. She read the first page. Age 34. Widowed 2 years ago. Wife Sarah, deceased from ALS. Vivian flipped to the financial summary. She stopped breathing for a second. The numbers were catastrophic. $412,000 in outstanding medical debt, credit score decimated, bank accounts holding a combined total of $84.12. Then she saw the scanned court document, an eviction notice filed 4 days ago, due in less than a month, arrears of $2,100. Finally, she looked at the photograph attached to the back. It was a school picture, a little girl with messy brown curls and a missing front tooth smiling brightly at the camera. Lucy Hayes, age 7. Vivian closed the folder. She looked down at her left wrist. She was wearing a Patek Philippe watch. It cost $85,000. It just sat on her wrist, ticking away the seconds, while the man who had literally breathed life into her lungs was about to be thrown out onto the street with his 7-year-old daughter for the cost of the clasp. He needed that $50,000 more than anyone she had ever met. It would have changed his entire reality. It would have erased the eviction, paid off the immediate hounds, given him a year of peace. And he had left it on her desk, because her arrogance was heavier than his desperation. Vivian stood up. She bypassed her purse, grabbed her coat, and walked out of the office. The sub-basement of the Croft Enterprises building was a concrete bunker. It smelled of industrial bleach, damp mop heads, and the metallic tang of the massive HVAC units that powered the glass tower above. It was 6:15 a.m. Ethan's shift was over. He sat on a slatted wooden bench in the cramped employee locker room, unlacing his boots. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. His knee had ballooned overnight, radiating a hot, pulsing agony down to his ankle. He finally managed to pry the right boot off, letting it drop to the linoleum floor with a heavy thud. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to rub the exhaustion out of his eyes. He had an hour to get home, change, get Lucy to school, and then catch the bus to a day labor site in the industrial district. He needed cash. He needed it today. The heavy metal door of the locker room squeaked open. Ethan didn't look up. "Frank, if that floor buffer is jammed again, you're on your own. I'm clocked out." "It's not Frank." Ethan froze. He knew that voice. It was raspy, cultured, and entirely out of place in a room that smelled like old sweat and floor wax. He looked up. Vivian Croft was standing in the doorway. She was wearing a long, camel-colored wool coat over a tailored charcoal suit. In the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the basement, she looked like an alien. Her eyes scanned the grim surroundings, the dented gray lockers, the peeling paint, the puddle of brown water near the drain, before locking onto him. Ethan slowly sat up straight. He didn't try to hide his bare, socked foot or his dirty uniform. "You're lost, Ms. Croft. The penthouse express elevator is about 40 floors up." Vivian didn't take the bait. She walked into the room, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking sharply against the concrete. She stopped a few feet from his bench. She looked exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes even more pronounced than they had been in her office. "I read your file," she said. There was no preamble, no corporate softening. Ethan's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck pulled tight. "Excuse me? David ran a background check. Standard protocol for anyone who interacts with me in an emergency capacity." Vivian pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. "You're drowning, Ethan. You have $400,000 in medical debt from your wife's illness. You have $84 in the bank, and you are 27 days away from being evicted with your 7-year-old daughter." Ethan felt a hot, blinding spike of rage. He stood up, completely ignoring the shooting pain in his knee. He stepped toward her, towering over her by half a foot. "You have absolutely no right," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating whisper. "You don't get to dig through my life just because you own the concrete I stand on." Vivian didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She held his gaze. "You're right. I don't. It was an invasion of privacy, and I'd apologize, but right now your pride is putting your child on the street, so I don't really care if you're offended." Ethan stopped. The mention of Lucy was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of his anger. He stared at her, his chest heaving. "What do you want from me? You want me to say I made a mistake? Fine. I made a mistake. I'm a broke, stupid janitor who let his ego get in the way of feeding his kid. Are you happy? Does that balance the spreadsheet? No, Vivian said quietly. It doesn't. She looked away for a second, staring at a dent in the locker next to him. When she looked back, the icy CEO persona was entirely gone. In its place was a bone-deep weariness. I've spent the last 3 years surrounded by people who would sell their own mothers to get a corner office, Vivian said. I pay them millions of dollars to advise me, to protect me, to steer this company. And on Tuesday night, while I was dying on the floor, my chief operating officer was at a steakhouse, and my board of directors was drafting a press release about my tragic passing to boost the quarterly stock price. She took a step closer to him. You had absolutely nothing to gain, she continued, her voice tightening. You could have walked out. You could have called security and let them handle it. You could have taken the $50,000 yesterday and never looked back. But you stayed. You broke my ribs. You saved my life. And then you told me to go to hell because I insulted you. Ethan crossed his arms. I didn't tell you to go to hell. I just told you to keep the money. Same thing in my world. Vivian offered a small, bitter half-smile. She held out the folded piece of paper. I didn't come down here to give you another check, Ethan. I know you won't take it. And frankly, handing you cash doesn't solve my problem. Ethan looked at the paper, then at her. What problem? I am entirely surrounded by sycophants, cowards, and vultures, Vivian stated flatly. I need someone in my orbit who isn't afraid of me. I need someone who understands exactly how fragile all of this actually is. I need someone who won't let me eat a walnut and who will tell me when I'm being a ruthless idiot. Ethan blinked, trying to process the whiplash of the conversation. I don't know the first thing about corporate logistics. I strip wax off linoleum. I don't need you to run logistics, Vivian countered. I have computers and MBAs for that. I need a director of executive operations. It's a made-up title. It means you manage my schedule, my security protocols, and the physical running of my life. It means you are the person standing between me and the vultures. Ethan stared at her. The absurdity of it was staggering. You're offering a janitor an executive job. I'm offering the man who refused to let me die a job, she corrected. Starting salary is $140,000 a year, full benefits. Zenith Facilities will release you from your contract today. Croft Enterprises has an on-site daycare center on the 7th floor. Your daughter, Lucy, can start tomorrow. Ethan's breath hitched. The daycare. The salary. It was a lifeline thrown from a passing helicopter. Why? Ethan asked, his voice cracking slightly. Because you feel guilty? Because I trust you, Vivian said simply. It was the most honest thing she had said in years. And because I owe you a massive debt. But since you refuse to let me pay it, I'm going to make you work for it. She pressed the folded paper against his chest. He instinctively brought his hand up to take it. It was a formal employment contract. Read it over, Vivian said, stepping back and pulling her coat tighter around her. If you want it, be on the 42nd floor at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Wear a suit. If you don't own one, buy one and expense it to the company. She turned and walked back toward the heavy metal door. She pushed it open but paused in the frame, looking back over her shoulder. And Ethan? He looked up from the paper. Yeah, don't let your pride make your daughter sleep in a car, Vivian said softly. It's not worth it. The heavy door swung shut behind her with a loud, echoing clang, leaving Ethan alone in the basement, holding the piece of paper that was about to rewrite the rest of his life. Ethan bought a charcoal suit off a clearance rack at a discount department store. The polyester blend was stiff, the shoulders were a half-inch too wide, and the pants pinched his waist. He stood in his cramped bathroom staring at the stranger in the mirror while he wrestled with a cheap navy tie. He looked like a man going to a court hearing he was bound to lose. He didn't care. The eviction notice was in the trash. At 7:30 a.m., Ethan walked into the lobby of Croft Enterprises holding Lucy's hand. He was used to entering this building through the loading dock in the alley, badging in next to the dumpsters. Today, he walked through the massive revolving glass doors at the front. The morning sun poured through the atrium, blinding and absolute. He dropped Lucy off at the 7th floor daycare. It looked less like a childcare center and more like a miniature Ivy League prep school. There were wooden Montessori toys, organic snack stations, and an iPad check-in system. Lucy clung to his leg, her eyes wide as she took in the pristine carpeted room. Ethan knelt, ignoring the tight pull of the cheap suit pants. He leveled his eyes with hers. "You're going to be okay, Bug. The lady at the front desk has my new number. I'm just upstairs, okay?" Lucy nodded slowly, her grip loosening. "Okay, Dad. Are you going to clean the big offices today?" "No," Ethan said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Not today. Today I'm just going to sit in one." He left her painting at a low table and took the elevator up to 42. The executive floor was a completely different ecosystem in the daylight. At midnight, it was a silent tomb. At 8 a.m., it was a war zone of ringing phones, clicking heels, and hushed, frantic conversations. Ethan walked out of the elevator, and the air seemed to leave the hallway. Secretaries paused their typing. Junior executives stopped mid-sentence. They all recognized him. You don't ignore the man who pushes a squeaking yellow cart past your desk every night for 3 years without recognizing his face, even if you never bothered to learn his name. Now, that face was wearing a suit and walking toward the CEO's office. David was standing outside Vivian's door. He took one look at Ethan and his jaw locked. "This is a joke," David muttered, blocking the door. "She's medicated. She's reacting to trauma. You have no business being on this floor, Hayes. You're a liability." "Then fire me, David," Ethan said, not breaking stride. He didn't stop until he was inches from the COO's face. "Oh, wait. You can't. Excuse me." He stepped around a seething David and pushed open the frosted glass door. Vivian was at her desk. She looked up, and for the first time since he had met her, a genuine, unscripted smile broke across her face. It didn't reach her eyes. She looked utterly exhausted, the weight of the impending board meeting crushing her. But it was real. "The suit is terrible," she said flatly. "It was $90, Ethan replied, taking the seat opposite her desk. The leather chair hissed as he sank into it. "And it itches. What am I doing here, Ms. Croft?" "Vivian," she corrected. "And you're doing exactly what I hired you to do. You're going to watch." For the next 8 hours, Ethan watched. He sat in the corner of her office while a parade of lawyers, analysts, and crisis PR managers cycled through. They spoke in acronyms and financial jargon, dissecting the hostile takeover bid led by a rival firm, Apex Holdings. The Croft Board of Directors was voting at 4 p.m. Apex needed a 2/3 majority to force the sale. They had half the board. They just needed 3 more votes. And Vivian's near-fatal allergy attack was the exact ammunition they were using to claim she was physically unfit to lead. Through it all, Ethan observed. He didn't know how a leveraged buyout worked, but he knew people. He knew exhaustion. He knew fear. He watched the way the lawyers avoided Vivian's eyes when they delivered bad news. He watched the way David kept checking his phone under the table. At 2 p.m., the office finally cleared out. Vivian rubbed her temples, looking gray. "They have the votes," she whispered to the empty room, forgetting Ethan was even there. "They're going to use my hospital trip to invoke the succession clause. It's over." Ethan stood up from the corner. He walked over to her desk and picked up a thick stack of printed emails the lawyers had left behind. "Can I ask you a question?" Ethan said. Vivian looked up, startled. "What?" "When I was emptying the trash in this building, I learned something very quickly," Ethan said, flipping through the papers. "People throw away their secrets. They shred the big stuff, sure. But the little stuff, the burner phone receipts, the scribbled notes on napkins, the printed emails they don't want on the company server, they just toss it in the blue bin." Vivian frowned, her corporate mind struggling to catch up to his blue-collar logic. "What are you talking about, Ethan?" "I'm talking about your COO, Ethan said. He tossed a specific printed email onto her desk. "David." Vivian looked at the paper. This is just an internal memo about the Apex merger. Look at the timestamp, Ethan said, pointing a calloused finger at the top corner. He printed this at 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks ago. I know, because I was the one who emptied his bin that night. I found 5 crumpled drafts of a non-disclosure agreement between David and Apex Holdings. He wasn't working late for you, Vivian. He was negotiating his own severance package with the people trying to buy you out. He's the one whipping the board votes against you. Vivian went entirely still. The air in the room grew heavy. She stared at the timestamp, her mind rapidly connecting the dots. The leaked financials, the sudden shift in board alliances. David's insistence on delaying the vote while she was in the hospital. He's selling me out, Vivian breathed, the realization hardening into cold, absolute fury. He thinks you're weak, Ethan said softly. He thinks because you almost died, you're done fighting. You're going to walk into that boardroom at 4 o'clock, and he's going to slide the knife in. Vivian stood up. The wince of pain from her ribs was barely noticeable this time. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him. The cheap suit, the tired eyes, the man who had seen the mechanics of her empire from the bottom up. Ethan, Vivian said, her voice dropping to a lethal calm. Get the head of IT on the phone. Tell him I need David's server access pulled the second the board meeting starts. Then I need you to walk with me. The boardroom was a theater of polished mahogany and quiet ruthlessness. 12 board members sat around the massive table. They were older, wealthy, and entirely detached from the physical reality of the company they governed. David sat at Vivian's right, wearing an immaculate bespoke suit, looking somber and deeply concerned. Vivian walked in at exactly 4 p.m. Ethan walked in right behind her. The room went dead silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. David stood up, his face flushing red. Vivian, David said smoothly, playing to the room. We are all thrilled to see you on your feet, but this is a closed session. Non-executives are not permitted. He shot a venomous glare at Ethan. Vivian ignored him. She took her seat at the head of the table. Ethan stood directly behind her chair, hands clasped in front of him, a silent, immovable sentry in a clearance rack suit. Ethan is my new director of executive operations, Vivian said, her voice carrying a sharp, ringing authority that echoed off the glass walls. He stays. An older board member at the far end cleared his throat. Vivian, let's be frank. We are here to vote on the Apex merger, but more pressingly, we are here to discuss your capacity. Tuesday night was alarming. The company cannot be tethered to a CEO who is one lunch order away from a coma. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. David looked down, hiding a smirk. I appreciate your concern, Richard, Vivian said coldly, but my health is fine. My judgment, however, has been deeply flawed. She opened a manila folder on her desk. She didn't look at the papers. She looked directly at David. I spent the last 3 years fighting off Apex, Vivian said, her voice rising in volume. I thought the threat was external. I was wrong. The threat was sitting on my right side. David's head snapped up. The smirk vanished. Vivian, what are you doing? 10 minutes ago, Vivian said, sliding a thick stack of printed emails across the polished mahogany. IT finished mirroring your personal cloud drive, David. The one you accessed from the company network late at night. The one containing your guaranteed CEO contract with Apex Holdings, contingent on you delivering this board's votes today. The boardroom erupted. Men in expensive suits were suddenly shouting. Papers were grabbed. Richard put on his reading glasses, his face turning pale as he scanned the top document. David stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. This is illegal. You hacked my drive. This is a violation of privacy. You used company servers to orchestrate corporate espionage. Vivian fired back, standing up to meet him. She didn't flinch. She leaned forward, planting her hands on the table. You're fired, David. Security is packing your office right now. Your keycard is deactivated. If you don't walk out of this building in the next 3 minutes, I am having you arrested for corporate fraud. David looked around the table. The board members were looking at him with disgust, not because he had betrayed Vivian, but because he had gotten caught. He was toxic waste now. He looked at Vivian, his chest heaving, and then he looked at Ethan standing calmly behind her. "You," David spat at Ethan. "You're a janitor. You belong in the basement." Ethan didn't blink. He just adjusted the cheap tie at his neck. "Maybe, but the trash is on this floor today, David. Time to go." David stormed out of the room. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him. The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian slowly sat back down. She looked around the table, making eye contact with every single board member. The vulnerability was gone. The injured girl they thought they could easily depose had been replaced by a predator who had just publicly executed her second-in-command. "Now," Vivian said, her voice dropping back to a terrifying, quiet calm, "are we voting on the Apex merger, or are we getting back to work?" No one raised a hand for the vote. The hostile takeover was dead in the water. An hour later, the 42nd floor was quiet again. Ethan stood in Vivian's office. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor. The exact spot where she had almost died just days ago was bathed in warm light. Vivian was standing by the window, a crystal glass of bourbon in her hand. She hadn't taken a sip. She was just holding it, staring out at the city. Ethan walked over, stopping a few feet behind her. "Lucy drew a picture in daycare today," he said quietly. "It's a yellow mop with a cape. I think I have a branding issue." Vivian let out a short, genuine laugh. She turned around to face him. The corporate armor was stripped away. She just looked like a woman who had survived a war. "You saved my life again today, Ethan," she said softly. "I just pointed out a timestamp," Ethan replied, shifting his weight. "You pulled the trigger." "No," Vivian said, taking a step toward him. "You grounded me. You made me see the dirt on the floor instead of just looking at the ceiling. I need that. This company needs that." She looked up at him. The height difference was stark, but the power dynamic had entirely shifted. They weren't Billionaire and Janitor anymore. They were two people who had seen each other at their absolute lowest, most desperate moments, and pulled each other out of the dark. "So," Vivian said, a soft, teasing edge returning to her voice. "Director of Executive Operations, you're going to need a better suit." Ethan smiled. The deep lines around his eyes crinkled, making him look his actual age for the first time in years. "I'll put it on the company card." He didn't kiss her. It wasn't a fairy tale, and the reality of their lives was far too complicated for a sudden cinematic embrace. But as they stood there in the quiet office, the space between them felt electric. It was the start of something entirely new. A partnership forged in broken ribs, cheap suits, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the only way to save an empire is to know exactly how to clean up the mess. Not every rescue looks like a movie, and not every hero wears a cape. Sometimes salvation comes from the person emptying the trash, and a second chance is paid for in broken ribs and bruised egos. Ethan and Vivian proved that the most powerful alliances aren't signed in boardrooms. They're forged in the moments when we have nothing left to lose. If this story of gritty redemption and shifting power dynamics hooked you, don't scroll away. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a real underdog story, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. See you next time.